Good afternoon and welcome if you're tuning in online, and hello again to those in the room at Politico's Energy and Climate UK Summit. My name is Charlie Cooper and I'm Senior UK Energy Correspondent. This panel, as I mentioned in the previous chat, is all about, it's called Rewiring the Country, and it is all about, how I see it sometimes, is that battle of two targets. Decarbonisation of the power grid by 2035 if you're the government, 2030 if you're Labour. That is a huge sort of step on the way to net zero 2050, eliminating those carbon emissions that come from the power sector. A brief reminder to talk to us on X if you're joining us online, or social media of your choice. Our hashtag is Politico Energy Climate UK. Also make sure to use our hashtag to ask questions during the upcoming discussion using on Slido if you're in the room. And please don't forget to mention your name and the organisation you are with when you do so. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our panellists. We have Tunne Langenen, Senior Policy Advisor on Climate and Energy Policy from the Tony Blair Institute. Mark Owen Lloyd, who is Director of the Botley West Solar Farm for Photovolt, that's in Oxfordshire. And Philip Dunn, MP for Ludlow and Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee. I thought I would start with a bit of audience participation, always a fan of that, and I'll describe for those joining online. Who in the room thinks that decarbonisation by 2035 is achievable? Hands up. A fairly slender smattering of hands, I'd say less than half. It's quite hard to judge, but I'd say less than half. Interesting question now, who thinks that decarbonisation by 2030 is possible, which is Labour's policy? Oof. Ed Miliband, you should be in this room. That's about 5 or 6 hands went up out of a fairly large audience. We did actually invite Labour to attend this panel and other panels. They unfortunately declined. I think you could probably look on Twitter and find out why. We think it's unfortunate, but there we are. I will sort of ventriloquise for the Labour position when we require it for the debate. But Tunne, to get us started, I should ask the panel, shouldn't I? How about for the three of you, 2030 or 2035, achievable? So let's start with you, Tunne.
I am going to be very diplomatic and say it's going to be very, very, very challenging.
Which one?
But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't double down our efforts.
And that's 2035?
Both of them.
Yeah.
Very, very challenging. They're not that different, actually, if you look into it. So
that's maybe the elephant in the room. Philip, I know you're not speaking for the government, but...
no, I'm certainly not speaking for the Labour Party. I think the 2030 ambition, let's just to put it in one piece of context, we are not going to get any new nuclear capacity on stream by 2030. That is an essential plank in order to decarbonise the economy by whatever date it can be done. I think 2035 has got enormous challenges, but is doable if, well, our committee is about to come out with a report. We're not going to opine on that, but we are going to point to what the challenges are shortly, and they remain, as I'm sure we'll be discussing, very significant. I think it's just about doable if everything goes right, and it rarely does in government.
And Mark, I see it as a kind of, well, it's a multifaceted challenge, but the two big chunks are getting the renewables or nuclear online, and then the grid. You are the director for a big solar farm. How do you see the feasibility of those two targets?
Well, my background is as a trader, so I'm always keen on stretching targets. You get there if you give people challenging targets. But I think 2030 is impossible. 2035 is doable, but we have to accelerate the pace at which we're building, consenting and installing both ground-mounted solar. I'll talk only about solar because that's where the area I know, and crucially, roof-mounted solar. So change the leasehold laws, make it more attractive for householders to put it on. So we've got to accelerate it and shorten the DCO process, not delay DCO consents.
Yes, we'll come to that in a moment, I'm sure. Tunne, you put out, from a kind of decarbonisation point of view, a very gloomy report last year, about this time last year, I think it was. So intriguing to know if you think anything's changed since. But the date that you put on the UK having sufficient renewables online to call itself a decarbonised electricity system was 2062. And then for the grid to be in a sort of place where it could deliver that 2062 was regardless of the grid. With the grid involved too, you're talking 2084, is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Why so gloomy? Are we doomed in terms of our efforts towards this goal?
Well, I mean, so first of all, let's take one step back. So delivering clean power is absolutely essential to delivering net zero. I'm sure I don't need to tell that to anyone in the room here, but whether it's 2030 or 2035, electrification is our best path to tackling and dealing with climate change and delivering net zero. And to do that, you need to make sure that that electricity is actually clean for it to lead to decarbonization. But I think whether it's 2035 or 2030, it's going to be hugely challenging, and it will require a massive step up in pace. We need to roughly quadruple the amount of renewable generation we have at the moment, and we need to double the capacity of the grid, which is huge challenges for a country that hasn't been doing a lot of building recently. A lot of progress has obviously happened this far, but as you set out, the pace of delivery, if we compare the pace of delivery over the last 10 years with what we need to do over the next 10 years, we're nowhere close. So the renewables pace, the pace of renewables being added need to roughly be 4 times more every year than what we do now, which is quite a lot if you think about it. And at the same time, it takes more than a decade to build a transmission line, and also more than a decade to build a new offshore wind farm. And as you were mentioning as well, nuclear, things like that, all of this is taking a whole lot of time, and we don't have a lot of time. I think the other thing to remember is that at the same time, this challenge is not actually just replacing one system with another. We're not replacing like for like, we're actually kind of completely transforming the way that we operate and do our energy system. So we're moving from a centralized system to a much more decentralized system, and we're moving from a kind of more static demand side and supply side to something where you got intermittent renewables and a more flexible demand side. And we're also experiencing increasing demand on electricity, and that's only going to be more and more of that with, for instance, more AI data centers, etc. So the challenge is kind of growing. And this comes with further challenges involved in delivering clean power, which we haven't talked about yet, or that hasn't been mentioned yet, but things like what do we do with long duration energy storage? What do we do with having kind of sufficient baseline supply of energy? And how do we get people along on this journey, both in terms of accepting new grid infrastructure in their homes or in their communities, but also how they can accept kind of being more flexible with how they use energy. But then there's also the opportunities, obviously, lower cost, energy security, and also a huge opportunity, I think, for UK clean tech, which I think is like the size of the prize there. So I think in some ways we should probably care less about the targets, even though they're really hard, and start focusing on the enablers to start getting us on the path to delivery. There's been a lot of arguing back and forth with 2030 and 2035, and I think we just need to...
Which I've encouraged, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Perhaps unfairly, I've asked you to set up the challenge. Philip, in your committee's inquiry into electrification of the UK economy, what solutions are you seeing coming through to some of those sort of pretty insurmountable sounding challenges that Tuan has set out?
So I think we've just heard a very sensible way of looking at this. I think targets are important to focus the mind within government. But what's much more important to secure delivery is having a plan within government, and a coherent plan which addresses all of the various components. Trying to electrify the economy is the biggest industrial undertaking that this country has ever sought to do in as short a period as we're talking about, whether it's 2030, 2035, but effectively we're trying to do it by 2050. That's the sort of end date. And it's going to be a massive challenge. We're not just talking about quadrupling solar, which we are. We're talking about, as you say, doubling the size of the grid. But we're also trying to change the way in which we consent for these enormous schemes, infrastructure projects. And I think one of the things the government did last autumn was to set out a sensible approach to try to halve the amount of time it takes to get a planning consent. Because one of the things that is different about this next wave of investment in renewables is that we're no longer sort of a market leader operating in our own bubble where we can generate the capacity, we can marshal international investment and corporates to build out the offshore wind turbines, which we've done very successfully for the last 15 years or so. We're now operating in a global environment where every other nation is trying to do the same thing at the same time, so that the competitive tension has become one where international, both investors and construction firms, and every stage of the supply chain is saying to itself, are we going to make this investment in the UK? And if we do, what are the barriers to getting that investment deployed? Or are we going to do it somewhere else in the world, which are also trying to do the same thing, where they may have very different barriers? They may be much easier. So in countries which have got plentiful land supply, introducing solar farms or pylons across unoccupied land is a lot easier than it is trying to do it in one of the most densely populated countries in Europe. So we have to try to change the mechanisms here if we're going to begin to achieve this. And that's what some of the measures to introduced, you touched on community acceptability. Yeah. That's absolutely critical. That's one of the things we're addressing in our report.
Okay, that's really interesting. We'll come on a bit more to the community acceptability point. But these are all matters that are very much on your desk, I imagine, Mark, day in, day out. I thought I would ask you, I mentioned it earlier, about speaking of the pace of change that we need to see, about consenting decisions. We have had just today from the Secretary of State a decision to delay by 1 month a decision on consenting for a major solar farm in Lincolnshire called Mallard Pass. I hear from people in the sector that there's concerns that, given the current state of politics around solar farms and around particularly the debate that exists around food security and solar farms, that actually we're not going to see any of those big consenting decisions for nationally significant infrastructure projects when it refers to solar being greenlit before the election. I mean, what's your reaction to the Secretary of State's decision today?
Well, it's the GCO process is long, arduous, very expensive. The region of £10 million we'll spend on the Botley West DCO, including large deposits to National Grid to secure the connection. We've got upwards of 60 experts working on it, planners, designers, biodiversity designers, and not to mention our team in Berlin. So it's a high risk in that money, if you don't get consent, is simply gone and you move on. But the attraction of the DC of the Planning Act 2008 and the DCO process is it gives some certainty. Mm-hmm. So you do everything you're supposed to do. You do your 2 consultations, you do your peer, you do your environmental statement, you go through an arduous examination, public examination, and then you get a decision. Now, Sonica went through that. They're going to be a year after. This
is another solar farm.
Sorry, Sonica is near Newmarket in
it's delayed 4 times?
Yeah, so it's good. If it gets permission at the next one, it'll be a year late.
Right.
So you think about when you make an application, you've got to set out you've got to start about buying the kit. You've got to start, because there's long lead times on transformers and power converter stations. And as Philip correctly pointed out, we're not alone here. The world is electrifying. I spoke to National Grid last week, and they said they're struggling to get their gas-insulated switchgear because the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have just bought the lot to electrify the system. So you've got to be aware of what everyone else is doing. So you set out on that journey, and the deal is, at the end of that, the Planning Inspectorate give their decision to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State, on the whole, tends to pass that on, or if there's a really good reason, legal reason, turns it down. Now, that hasn't happened in Sonica. Mallard Pass has been delayed by a
just
month.
A month.
So was Sonica first time. Then Sonica was 35 days. So these are, I guess, political decisions, and they won't be made until the election has happened. But that's
you agree with that proposition that a lot of this, well, all these big solar projects are probably going to be on hold now until after the election?
Well, in terms of from the developer's point of view, you carry on.
Yeah.
So we're carrying on. We'll submit our application.
But as far as the Secretary of State,
So as Secretary of
consent
State, I
is
think the feeling is that there is unpopular, and MPs have expressed a fear. Certainly the MPs we've spoken to in West Oxfordshire, and they have expressed a fear that if they support us, even the Lib Dem candidate for the new seat of Bicester and Woodstock has said he opposes us, even though it's his party's policy, has been for 30 years to build solar farms. So he said, I can't support you because my constituents, potential constituents, don't want it, which I think is wrong.
This contrast between the National Party's position around decarbonisation and the local constituency demands.
And yet, in the recent local elections in West Oxfordshire, in May, beginning of May, the group who opposes Stop Botley West, one of their numbers stood for Blaydon and Woodstock. Blaydon is in the heart of our project and is vehement in its opposition. He stood as a Tory candidate for councillor on opposition to us and lost to Liberal Democrats. So I don't know, maybe it's not so unpopular. Maybe if you take a position and say, because as Philip said, we need to have a plan.
Yeah.
The problem is it's all quite piecemeal, but there is urgency here because stuff needs to be ordered and lead times are long. It's going to take us 2 years to build if we get consent, and we've probably got another 18 months till we get consent if we get it. So these are very long lead times, and you need to shorten them as much as you can.
And whether or not it genuinely is a popular proposition in a constituency to have that solar farm built or not, there certainly does seem to be a perception in the Conservative Party at the moment among many MPs in rural constituencies that big solar farms are going to prove unpopular. And I can't help reading into the Secretary of State's decision today, into the statement that came out yesterday around the debate between food security and solar panels, a bit of a political calculation ahead of an election there. You're standing down at the next election, Philip. Do you feel liberated to sort of speak your mind on this one?
So I'm a farmer.
And you're also a farmer.
But I also have solar panels on my farm sheds. And personally, I've got 1/4 megawatt on my farm, 4 farm sheds altogether. And I think that's the right place to do it. And it makes sense for me because I'm a potato farmer and we have electricity demand for 8 months of the year, and it's coming from the roof. I think the constituency concern that I've had has been for clustering of solar farms. I have a small number of, not large in your terms, but 50 acre to 100 acre farms, which, solar farms, and the people generally speaking, the immediate neighbours will object to that, but they won't object if it's relatively isolated. The problem you get is if you're hundreds of acres or hectares, or thousands in your case, then you're creating a clustering effect which affects a much larger neighbourhood. From a farming point of view, I think the Secretary of State was quite right to say earlier this week that there is a balance to be struck here between productive agricultural land and using it for energy purposes. So restricting solar farms so that they're not built on grade 1, 2 or 3A land, I think was the right political decision. Now, the industry has said that will restrict the scale of solar farms that can be developed, and that's probably true. But we have to come to a balance amongst the population. How are we going to make this work? And taking high-quality agricultural land out of production at a time when we see what impact climate change is having on global food supply routes. We've just done a report on food security earlier this year. It's a short-sighted answer, in my view, and I think the Secretary of State's made the right one.
Interesting. Turner, hearing this debate and this discussion, I mean, does it give you pause about this is just one of several, but here's an exception to a situation where it's easy to do a big energy project because there is a political debate to be had there and there are political interests concerned. Is this the kind of thing that we're just going to see again and again and again on the road to decarbonisation?
I think so. I think absolutely, and I think this is the kind of thing that we're starting to realize now. Setting the ambition and getting people to agree on tackling climate change has been, it's been obviously a challenge, but we've kind of got there now, and people kind of broadly agree that we should deal with this, and that's why we've got all these very ambitious targets. But we haven't done enough to talk about some of the trade-offs, and you do need to talk about these trade-offs, because there are trade-offs, and there are decisions that need to be made. And I think we need to shift the kind of political will away from kind of arguing about the targets to start thinking about some of these trade-offs and actually drive through some of these changes. So an example is planning reform, right? Where that is absolutely essential. And probably as a political leader, as a politician, you're going to have to take a bit of a hit on some of it because you're not going to make everyone happy, but you should do it in the best way that you can. So think about how do you bring communities along? How do you, for instance, create a spatial energy plan that means that people can understand why certain infrastructure is being put in certain places. And again, you can use kind of data and understanding of our land and our landscape to kind of better plan and assess where it's best placed to have these things. But there will always be trade-offs, and there are so many of them that will come in the years to come. It's going to be really challenging.
I'm getting a sort of a vibe of targets. Let's not focus too much on them. But I think if there was a Labour representative on this panel, they'd probably be saying, well, how do you attract that investment? How do you give the certainty to investors? How do you give the certainty that the government is wholeheartedly behind this and will back this effort? Well, you put a big, ambitious target on it. And hey, I've even had conversations with Labour officials who have said, yes, we recognise 2030 is very, very difficult, but aim for the sun, hit the moon kind of approach. I mean, surely the targets are going to be, actually Labour's target is actually going to be quite helpful in that regard. And do you think we will see an acceleration in investment and in pursuit of this goal, thanks to having a more early target, essentially?
So first of all, that target can be useful if it's, I think the good thing about the 2030 target is that it's basically almost within the next parliament. So if Labour comes into government, they will be really accountable for delivering that.
It's going to be interesting.
So that is obviously a positive thing. I think in terms of the investment, though, I think if you speak to investors, they will say, the targets are secondary to actually putting in place the conditions that makes that a kind of viable investment. And I think right now, those conditions are not in place. So I think that just saying, oh yeah, we put in these really ambitious targets and that means that capital will flow into renewables, I think is not.
Do you like what you're hearing from Keir Starmer on that? Because I put that question to him when they had a weird huddle when they announced their 28 billion climb down. They got all the journalists into a room in Westminster, and him and Rachel Reeves just told us all about it. And I asked him about that question, and he said that that's our goal, that to get those conditions in place. It's not about the money necessarily even, it's about the conditions, it's about planning reform.
Yeah.
I've got a question on Slido, which is how quickly do you think, you've written a really sort of comprehensive report on this, if Labour is going to get anywhere near that 2030 clean power target, does this have to be a sort of first 100 days, first 100 minutes of government type thing? And what's the first thing they need to do? Is it planning reform?
Yeah, as planning reform, I think is the absolute first thing. Then you need to look at things like, how Ofgem makes decisions. You need to really get the strategic spatial energy plan through. Mm-hmm. So that all of that is really important.
It's currently in the works with the National Energy System Operator.
It is indeed. So I think that needs to happen really quickly, and the planning reform you introduced needs to be really bold, because frankly, if you look at what's in the pipeline in terms of projects, a lot of it's at a very, very early stage, which means that, and we got 6 years?
Yeah.
That it takes a long time to build this stuff. So the planning reform needs to be incredibly ambitious, and then you need to think about supply chain issues and stuff like that as well, in terms of how you can do that strategic planning to get things done.
Mark, as a developer, what do you want to see in the first 100 days of a Labour government on all of those obstacles?
Well, I suspect, given that any DCO that comes up for consent will have been held, I'd like to see the dam open, so return to previous. Because to be fair to the Secretary of State for ESNZ, there have been consents granted, and actually a few weeks ago there was a wind farm extension was actually turned down by the planning inspectorate and was approved by was overturned by Claire Coutinho with some conditions. So I'd like to see the uncertainty, because as Turner mentioned, there's a lot of money involved, and there's other countries involved. If this continues, then there are 33 DCO projects on the PINS NSIP website at the moment. It's about 15 gigawatts. That's not nearly enough. That's for connection out to about 2032, so that needs to be double. But if there's any kind of continuing delay and extension of DCO times, then people won't want to spend the 10 million on doing the project, on funding the DCO. So, no, you'd like certainty. That's the key thing, and also the national policy statements, the ENs 1 to 5, are really firm, and they're really pro-renewables and pro-ground-mounted solar. So just stick to those. Don't politically interfere.
Can I just come in? I think that's a really important point that you're making, that most of what the Labour Party might be talking about needs to be done is being done. The question is, how quickly can it be done? Mm-hmm. And we just heard, having a target for which everybody in this room, bar 5 people, think is for the birds, doesn't really help bring that about. It's just pure semantics. It's a political gesture. We've got, at the moment, 675 gigawatts in the queue for the grid right now. That is more than double the increase required to be at by 2035. So we've got the projects out there. A lot of the projects are never going to be developed. So I think the Secretary of State was quite right last autumn to say we're going to get to a situation where we use it or lose it, these consents, because otherwise it just clogs up the whole system. So the demand is there. Many of the projects are available to go through the consenting process. It's just the time it takes. We've got to accelerate, as everybody's agreed on the panel, both the planning and the grid connection, and the grid connect, both of which are politically challenging in the local community. So we've got to try and make the community, we can get onto this before we finish, community benefit has to be demonstrable to change attitudes and behaviours. And that's where I think the proposal that's come out from this government to require 2 types of community benefit. So household bills, if you're immediately affected by a significant piece of infrastructure, will come down for 10 years by £1,000 a year. And then community benefits to the local parish or whatever it happens to be for a pylon in the parish, an underground or overground cabling, is a really good idea. It will start to change the dynamic. It's not all bad news. There is some good news in there. And I think people's behaviour will start to change.
Do you have the perception that these campaigns against pylons in your parish, as it were, are they deeply rooted? I spoke to one MP who said that, MP who'd been around for some time, he said that in all his years he'd never seen his constituents so worked up about something as the East Anglian energy grid. And I was quite astonished to hear that. Is it really that bad? Are people really that concerned? Are your constituents that concerned? I had it
in my constituency when the mid-Wales turbines, onshore turbines, were all needed to get access to the grid coming straight across a beautiful unspoilt valley in my constituency. And people were absolutely furious. We had marches in the streets along the Welsh border. So people do care a lot about this, but I've also seen it in other places where they're a bit more used to it, where they've been less they've accepted in the past. I think East Anglia, the challenge there actually is as much about the number of connection points, leave aside the solar, coming from offshore, and the volume of constituencies that are being affected by these multiple access points, rather than trying to channel them or use a offshore ring main, which was what I think the public would prefer.
Labour seems absolutely determined to really take on that challenge. Keir Starmer in his conference speech used language like sort of bulldozing through the planning restrictions, which almost seems sort of designed to trigger sort of NIMBY concerns in various green and leafy parts of the country.
Well, very few of them vote Labour. Might have something to do with it.
That might have something to do with it, as much as they're prepared to. Do you see that being the tenor of the next 5 years if Labour do get in? Are we going to see sort of Daily Mail front pages of, Keir Starmer's steel warriors attacking our country?
Well, I hope this doesn't become sort of totally partisan. It shouldn't be a partisan debate. As was said earlier, there is now political consensus that we are driving to net zero. So this is a consequence of it. We've got to change behaviour, and it's in all political parties' interests, in my view, to try to go with the grain and persuade people that this is a sensible thing to do, and that will require, cash handouts by developers in some areas, and it will require, other behavioural nudges. Tony Blair Institute's very good at advising on nudges, and I think it's right. We do actually have to do that, and it shouldn't become partisan. Of course, when you get down to the local pressure on the councillors who are making the local planning decisions, then it tends to, the incumbent of whatever party tends to come under a lot of pressure to object.
I do think if you scratch the surface of a lot of these NIMBY campaigns, I live in East Anglia, and you do see the, green is not green if it's a pylon tearing through my countryside. I do wonder, surely the person who's put that sign up is also a pretty strong advocate of net zero 2050. Do we need more, do we need a vast public information campaign from the government to say, like, this is why you're seeing all this building work going on? This is the industrial revolution that you talked about. Mark, I think you're interested in the idea of a public information campaign, and Tuna, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would, loathe to ask you just because you're from the Tony Blair Institute, what Tony Blair would do, but what would a sort of master of public, public opinion do to kind of bring the country round on this? Mark first.
Well, yeah, I've done 20 public events in the last 18 months, for our public consultations, and the overriding feeling I got from people, and most of the conversations were very, very sensible, that people just wanted to know, was the lack of understanding of why this was happening. Mm-hmm. And there was a genuine belief that our solar farm, for example, was simply a speculative money-making venture, and that actually it wasn't needed. And if it was needed, couldn't it be in Scotland? So there was, and a lot of, or East Anglia actually was a popular candidate.
Somewhere with lower house prices.
Well, I said, fine, we have lower rent prices, because renting land in Oxfordshire is mighty expensive. But I think the point was that a lot of the conversations began with the words, I have an electric car. It's part of the problem. But you need to explain to people what is happening. The UK has never really had an energy policy. And we've tended to back the wrong fuel. Oil in the 70s and the dash for gas. It's not been a great track record. And what we seem to be doing here is we're going for renewables. We're not going to build any, or we're not going to build enough. But we've passed the Climate Change Act, and we've closed all our coal-fired power stations. Or, Ratcliffe's got a few more months to go. So we're actually going to run out of generation. So we've got to do something, and we need to explain that to people. One person in the Bladen event said to me, well, we have all those nukes. I said, we're closing them. And she had absolutely no idea. There is no, why would there be? Your electricity appears, it's fine. But I think, yes, public education or explanation of the strategy, why it's happening. Philip mentioned that, the opposition to pylons in the 50s when the high voltage grid was built. There was huge resistance to all these in the countryside. People lying down in the road. When Didcot, the only other generation in Oxfordshire, the gas-fired power station, or coal originally, was built, they lay down in the road to stop the lorries getting through to build it. And yet, when it closed, there was a campaign to keep the cooling towers. So, you need to explain to people why it's happening. What you can't do is just appear in their village hall and say, this is for your own good. It's going to happen, so you might as well go along with it. You've got to explain.
What do you think, Tuna? Do you think Labour could do with toning down the sort of the bulldozing language, or is that the kind of attitude that we need?
We definitely need a lot more infrastructure, and it's going to have to be in place where people don't want it. And I think one of the key things that needs to happen is better decision-making in government that is transparent and understandable for people. Because I think at the moment, one of the problems is that people don't understand why. So I think, take the kind of East Anglia example. I think there's a lot to talk about an offshore grid. That becomes the big thing. And it's because there's a lack of understanding there's been a lack of kind of transparency around how some of these decisions have been made. And I think having that transparency, having that kind of plan so that people understand why this has happened, I think is really important. And then I think secondly, on consumer benefits, I think you need to do a bit of both, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to have some sort of consumer benefits for people, because the truth is we talk a lot about the kind of lower bills type of argument, but that comes after, right? So people won't get lower bills until quite a few more years because of the kind of investments that we're making now. But I think it's really important then that those consumer benefits are quite, community benefits are quite standardized in a way. So it doesn't become like a whole big discussion then about what community benefits am I going to get, and the national grid gets stuck in like discussions with every single local community on the way when they're trying to build this grid infrastructure. So I think we need to be a bit smarter about how we do some of these things.
Yeah.
Just on community benefits, I mean, there are now very tangible benefits to individuals. The 160,000 people, households that have installed solar panels on their roofs in the last year are very good advocates for what that means to their bills, because they can see it. They've got a smart meter. They know exactly what they were paying prior to getting the solar, and if they've got battery as well, they were getting a bigger benefit. I have a passive house development in my constituency where the heating cost, it's not quite the same directly as solar, but the heating cost has gone down by 90% for the people living, the tenants living in these social homes. And that means they're paying, ahead of the energy spike, they were paying £10 a month instead of £100 a month. This is very tangible, and they will be very good advocates, those who've got solar. We're going to have a more distributed generating system, so it's not all going to be point to point by these enormous, from one power station to where it's consumed. So, I think there's an advocacy army of early adopters amongst individuals as well as businesses out there, and they need to be motivated to tell their story.
Tony, you wanted to comment?
No, I was just going to say, I think this is a really important point. There's often a lot of talk about kind of government having big kind of consumer awareness campaigns or whatever, but that's not usually what's most impactful, right? Who you listen to most is like your neighbor or your friend or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, like we need to find a way to kind of create this kind of positive demand-led transition where people want solar panels, heat pumps, passive house standards on their homes, etc., and tell their neighbor and their friend. And that's really, I think, the more impactful way that you create this change, rather than the government telling you that you need to do this.
Can you generate that with a bit of government money into your pocket?
We took VAT off solar panels, and now coming off batteries. That's 20% cheaper suddenly overnight.
If you could all do one thing, if you were an incoming Prime Minister after the election, be it a Conservative one or a Labour one, if you could do one thing to really kickstart this industrial revolution as it's been described towards decarbonisation, be it 2030, 2035, or later if we fail, what would it be? Starting with you Mark. And don't just say, get Botley West built.
No, I'm not going to say shorten DCOs, but maybe, ZARs are very popular, but somebody needs to absolutely oversee the plan. So get the plan. For example, very quickly, there's a 2,500 house development on the edge of our solar farm, brand new by Grosvenor Estate, not a single solar panel on the roof because as the planning inspector said, kicked out the requirement because you don't have to do that. So that kind of join it all up, have a strategy, and have someone overseeing it to deliver it.
Philip?
I'd create a cabinet subcommittee whose job was to develop a plan across government.
Doesn't exist. It staggers me that doesn't exist already.
There are, but they have lots of other responsibilities. I would say, just as we did it ahead, in order to come up with the nationally determined contribution of 68% for the COP26, the Prime Minister of the day created a cabinet subcommittee. It was all government departments had to feed into it, and they had a single objective. What is the number that we've got to come to as a nation? And it took them about a year, and they came up with it. It can be done, and that's what decarbonisation of the economy requires.
Tuna?
Planning reform firstly, and then secondly, I think, you need to restructure Whitehall and how the government works. And I think you need to centralise much more in kind of number 10, take leadership, and then you need to set up the SNS department for delivery.
And the noises that you're hearing from Keir Starmer, from Ed Miliband about their ambitions, should they get into government, do you feel like they're getting that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it sounds like they are. I mean, the kind of 2030 mission is clearly really important to them, and they're putting together plans for how to do that. Okay.
Any insight you can give to those plans that you're picking up at the Tony Blair Institute?
No comment.
Will we still have a DESNES, or will it be called something else?
I don't know. You're going to have to ask the Labour Party.
Try and get a Labour Party spokesman to turn up. That would be a good start.
Yes, it would be. Well, I think we are coming close to the end of our time, so I think it leaves me only to say a big thank you to our panel for a stimulating discussion. I think I'm probably a bit gloomier about our ability to hit these targets than I was when we set out, but I think we can all agree it's going to be an interesting few years because Labour have put it so central in their political offer. They've said we're going to do 2030, we're going to get there, and by 2029, the next election, should they win this one, people are going to be able to judge them on whether they get there or not. So it's going to be an interesting few years. So thank you for your insights, your expertise. Thanks so much for coming. Cheers. Now, I think we are now heading for a networking break, which I believe takes place in here for the people in the room. The next session starts at 3:45, or perhaps a little bit. 3:45 still, we're still on time. That's not bad going. 3:45, that's going to tackle contracts of difference and the UK's green innovation competitiveness, moderated by my colleague Abby Wallace. Thank you so much for coming and enjoy the refreshments. Cheers.